Hey friends, tonight we're uncovering something ancient. You've been told that Neanderthals were brutish loners, that they lacked the social complexity of modern humans, that their extinction came from an inability to cooperate like we do. The truth? It's far more incredible. So dim those lights, get comfortable, and tell me in the comments where you're joining from tonight. Now, let the modern world fade. Because 43,000 years ago, in the limestone caves of what we now call Croatia, an outcast named Kira was about to discover something that would echo through time. Something that lives in every notification ping, every social media refresh, every desperate need for connection you've ever felt. This is what really happened in deep time. The morning light had barely touched the cave entrance when Kira felt again that familiar ache in her chest, like a stone pressing against her ribs. She sat at the edge of the group's sleeping area, close enough to feel their warmth, but far enough to know she wasn't truly part of it. Her fingers traced a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, the mark that had changed everything. 3 winters ago, during the mammoth hunt, when the beast's tusk had caught her face and sent her tumbling down the ravine. She'd survived, but something in the way others looked at her had died that day. The anthropological evidence tells us that Neanderthals cared for their injured. We found heel bones, evidence of medical care, individuals who lived for years with disabilities that would have required group support. But care and inclusion aren't the same thing. Care can be given from a distance. Inclusion requires something more. Kira watched as Dren, the group's leader, distributed the morning's tasks with subtle gestures and eye contact. A nod to Core for hunting. A hand motion to Lyra for plant gathering. Even young Tam received his assignment, keeping the fire fed. But Dren's eyes skipped over Kira, as if she were just another shadow on the cave wall. She understood the logic. Her depth perception had never fully returned after the injury. She couldn't track prey like before. Her aim with a spear was uncertain. In a world where every member needed to contribute directly to survival, what use was someone who could no longer hunt effectively? But her mind had never been sharper. The injury that had damaged her body had somehow heightened her awareness of everything else. She noticed things others missed. Patterns in the weather, changes in animal behavior, the subtle tensions between group members that could explode into conflict if left unchecked. She tried to share these observations at first. When she noticed that Grok favored his left leg after hunts, suggesting an injury, he was hiding. When she observed that certain plants flowered earlier than usual, indicating a shift in seasons. But her words fell on deaf ears. Without the status that came from successful hunts or gathering, her voice carried no weight. Modern neuroscience shows us that social rejection activates the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury. The anterior cingulate cortex fires up, creating genuine agony. We call it hurt feelings. But for our ancestors, social pain was a survival threat as real as any predator. As the hunting party prepared to leave, Kira caught Core watching her. For a moment, she thought she saw sympathy in his eyes. They'd grown up together, had learned to nap flint side by side as children. But sympathy wasn't inclusion. It wasn't belonging. "Your eye," Core said quietly, approaching her. "Does it still pain you?" Kira shook her head. The physical pain had faded moons ago. What remained was deeper, harder to heal. "I could speak to Dren," Core offered. "Perhaps you could help with tool making. Your hands are still skilled." "My hands were always secondary to my eyes," Kira replied. "And tool making happens in the center camp. I make them uncomfortable there." It was true. The scar was part of it, the twisted tissue that made children stare and adults look away. But it was more than that. She'd become a reminder of vulnerability, of how quickly a productive member could become a burden. Her presence made them confront their own fragility. Course shifted uncomfortably. "You could still contribute. Somehow." "I do contribute," Kira said softly. "I see things. I understand patterns. But seeing isn't valued like killing. Understanding is a way like meat." The conversation died there, as such conversations always did. Core rejoined the hunting party, and Kira remained in her liminal space. Not quite outcast, not quite member. But today, something was different. Today, she'd noticed more than usual. She'd seen Tam limping slightly, a turned ankle he was trying to hide, probably fearful of being seen as weak. She'd observed how old Mora kept touching her throat when her grandson joined the hunt, a nervous gesture that suggested hidden worry. She'd noticed that Lyra's gathering basket was poorly woven, likely because her attention was divided by some private concern. All these small dramas, these invisible threads of worry and fear, playing out in silence, each person trapped in their own concerns, unaware that others might understand, might help, might share the burden. The group dispersed to their daily tasks, leaving Kira alone with the dying embers of the morning fire. She fed it absently, watching the smoke rise and dissipate. Smoke could carry signals, she knew. Other groups used it to communicate across distances. But what if communication could happen within a group? What if the invisible threads she saw could be made visible? She thought about spider webs, how each strand was fragile alone, but together created something that could trap prey many times the spider's size. What if human connections worked the same way? What if the isolation each person felt was actually an opportunity? The idea was so foreign to everything she'd known that she almost dismissed it. Neanderthal society was hierarchical, structured. Information flowed down from leaders to followers. Bonds formed along family lines or hunting partnerships. What she was imagining, a web of connections based on shared information and mutual support, had no precedent. But precedent had never helped her. Traditional ways had left her on the margins. If she wanted to belong, she would have to create new ways. She stood slowly, her decision made. If the group wouldn't include her in their daily patterns, perhaps she could create new patterns. Perhaps she could weave something from these invisible threads that everyone else seemed too busy to notice. Her first target would be Tam. Young, vulnerable, trying to hide weakness just as she had. If she could help him without exposing him, if she could create trust where none existed before, she didn't know that what she was about to create would outlive her by 40,000 years. She didn't know that she was about to discover one of humanity's most powerful tools. Not fire, not the spear, but something far more subtle and enduring. The social network was about to be born, and would begin with a scarred woman and a limping boy, connected by understanding rather than blood, by choice rather than tradition. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the limestone cliffs, and Kira began to move with purpose for the first time in 3 winters. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as Kira made her way to the stream where Tam was meant to be gathering water. The path was familiar. She'd walked it thousands of times before injury, back when she'd been one of the group's most promising hunters. Now she walked it as something else, though she wasn't sure what yet. She found him exactly where she'd expected, sitting on a boulder with his right foot elevated, his water vessel still empty. The boy's face was a study in misery, pain, fear, and shame warring for dominance. When he heard her approach, he quickly lowered his foot and tried to stand, grimacing as weight hit the injured ankle. "Don't," Kira said simply, settling onto a flat rock a respectful distance away. The pretense hurts more than the injury. Tam's face flushed deeper. "Go away. I don't need your pity." "Good. I'm not offering any." Kira pulled out her flint knife and began stripping bark from a nearby sapling, her movements calm and purposeful. Pity is useless. Understanding, however, that is value. At 13 winters, Tam was at that precarious age where everything mattered too much. Too old to be coddled as a child. Too young to have proven himself as an adult. In their society, these transition years were crucial. A boy who showed weakness might never be fully accepted into the hunting parties, might always be given the lesser tasks, the safer positions that carried less honor. "I'm fine," Tam insisted, but his voice cracked on the words. "Just need a moment." "You need 3 days," Kira corrected without looking up from her work. "Maybe 4. The swelling will peak tomorrow, then gradually reduce if you keep it bound and elevated when possible." Tam stared at her. "How do you?" "Because I've hidden injuries too. We all have." She gathered enough bark now and began separating it into strips. "When I was your age, I cracked a rib during training. Bound it with hide. Told no one. Hunted anyway. You know what happened. Despite himself, Tam leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming sullenness. It broke completely during a chase. Punctured something inside. I coughed blood for a full moon cycle. Nearly died. She began weaving the bark strips together with practiced efficiency. Pride is expensive when you're young. You think you have endless time to heal. You don't. Modern psychology calls it the vulnerability trust loop. When we show our weakness to another person and they respond with help rather than exploitation, it creates a bond stronger than shared strength ever could. But in the Pleistocene, vulnerability could mean death. If Dren finds out... Tam's voice was barely a whisper. Why would he? Kira finished a makeshift binding and set it beside him. You gathered water. The task was completed. How you completed it is your business. She moved to the stream and began filling one of his vessels. The leather container was well made, probably by his mother. Each family had their own patterns, their own ways of stitching and decorating. These vessels carried stories, identities, connections. I saw you stumble yesterday. Kira continued conversationally. When you jumped the narrow part of the stream coming back from firewood gathering, you landed heavy on your left, overcompensating. That tells me the injury is at least 2 days old. Tam's eyes widened. You were watching me? I watch everyone. It's what I do now. There was no self-pity in the statement, just fact. When you can't participate, you observe. You learn to read the body's language. Every limp tells a story. Every favored side reveals a weakness. Every hidden pain shows in how someone moves when they think no one's looking. She filled another vessel. The sound of water, a peaceful counterpoint to their conversation. Your injury probably happened during the climbing practice. The eastern rocks, where the holes are weathered. Third or fourth pitch, where the foot placement gets tricky. How could you possibly know that? Because that's where I felt your age. Because that's where Core twisted his ankle 5 winters ago. Because that's where every young climber learns the difference between confidence and capability. She smiled slightly. Some patterns repeat across generations. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals had sophisticated observational skills. Their hunting strategies required reading subtle signs, disturbed vegetation, faint tracks, minute changes in animal behavior. But Kira had turned this outward-focused skill inward, toward her own kind. Here, she said, bringing the filled vessels closer. Let me show you how to bind it properly. Too tight, and you'll cut off blood flow. Too loose, and it won't support. Tam hesitated, then slowly extended his foot. The ankle was indeed swollen. Purple bruising beginning to show. Kira's hands were gentle but efficient, wrapping the bark strip binding in a pattern that provided support while allowing flexibility. Where did you learn this? Tam asked as she worked. From watching the healer work on others. From experiencing my own injuries. From thinking about how bodies want to move versus how they need to be held. She secured the binding with a simple knot that could be adjusted as swelling changed. Knowledge comes from many sources if you're willing to see them. As she worked, she shared other observations. How certain plants near the water could reduce swelling. Not the ones a healer typically used, but others she'd noticed animals eating after injuries. How shifting weight through the hips rather than the ankles could maintain mobility while healing. How to read the color of bruises to understand the healing timeline. Information, the first currency of any social network. Why are you helping me? Tam asked when she finished. The question seemed pulled from him reluctantly, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. Kira considered her answer carefully. This was the crucial moment, the one that would determine whether a single act of kindness became something more. Because isolation is a luxury we can't afford, she said finally. You're hiding an injury that could heal cleanly with proper care. I'm hiding knowledge that could help, but has no voice. Apart, we both lose. Together, she let the word hang. Together was not a concept of society much entertained outside of blood relations or hunting partnerships. But she could see Tam processing it, considering possibilities he'd never imagined. What do you want to return? He asked, because in their world, everything had a price. Kira said simply, you see things I don't. You go places I can't. You hear conversations I'm not part of. Share what you learn, and I'll share what I know. It was a radical proposition. Information in their society was power, hoarded by those who had it, begged for by those who didn't. The idea of freely exchanging it, of creating value through sharing rather than withholding, went against every tradition. But Tam was young enough to see past tradition, and heard enough to value help over hierarchy. I saw tracks yesterday, he said slowly, testing this new dynamic, near the eastern hunting grounds. Too large for deer, wrong shape for boar. The hunters haven't mentioned them. Kira filed this information away carefully, described them. As Tam talked, she listened with the full attention that so few people ever received. She asked clarifying questions, drew connections to other signs she'd noticed. By the time he finished, they'd painted a picture of what might be cave bears moving to lower elevations, crucial information that could affect the whole group's survival. You should tell Dren, Tam said when they realized the implications. He wouldn't listen to me, but you could mention it casually when you returned with the water. Kira began gathering the remaining empty vessels. You don't need to mention how you had time to notice such details. Understanding dawned in Tam's eyes. Information could flow through different channels. Credit didn't always have to go to the source. Value could be created without recognition. They returned to camp separately, Tam walking steady with the binding hidden beneath leather wrappings. To any observer, nothing had changed. The boy had completed his water-gathering task. The outcast woman had spent another day alone. But beneath the surface, the first thread of Kira's network had been woven. A connection based on mutual benefit, on shared vulnerability, on the radical idea that information increased in value when shared rather than hoarded. That night, as the group settled around the fire, Kira noticed Tam speaking quietly with one of the senior hunters. She saw the man's expression shift from dismissive to interested as Tam described the tracks. By morning, scouts would be sent to investigate. The information had flowed. The network had functioned. And across the fire, Tam caught her eye and nodded slightly, acknowledgement, gratitude, and promise all in one small gesture. Neither of them noticed Mora watching this exchange, or the thoughtful expression that crossed the elder's face. But then again, Kira was still learning that in networks, every connection creates ripples, and every thread touches others in ways the weaver cannot always predict. 3 days passed before Mora approached her. The old woman moved with the careful precision of age, each step deliberate, each gesture considered. At 60 winters, ancient by Paleolithic standards, Mora had survived through wisdom rather than strength, through observation rather than action. Kira was working at the edge of camp, napping flint into small, precise tools. Her depth perception may have been compromised for hunting, but for close work, her remaining vision was sharp as ever. She discovered that the injury had actually improved her ability to focus on detail, as if losing part of her sight had concentrated what remained. The boy walks better, Mora said without preamble, settling beside her with a soft grunt. His water-gathering injury heals remarkably well. Kira's hands didn't pause in their work. The rhythm of stone on stone was meditative, allowing her to think while appearing occupied. Boys heal quickly, when they allow themselves to. Mora's eyes, nested in deep wrinkles, missed nothing. He allowed you to help. That's unusual. The concept of social capital wouldn't be formalized for 40,000 years, but Mora understood it instinctively. In small groups, reputation was everything. Who you could trust, who would help you, who might betray you. This knowledge meant survival. Unusual times call for unusual actions, Kira replied carefully. She'd set down a completed blade and picked up a new core, examining it for the best striking angle. Indeed, Mora was quiet for a moment, watching Kira work. The bear tracks, he reported, saved us from a dangerous encounter. Dren is pleased. The boy's status rises. Good for Tam. Good for whoever taught him to observe so carefully. Mora's tone was knowing. Whoever helped him have the time to notice such things while supposedly gathering water with an injured ankle. Kira finally looked up, meeting the elder's gaze directly. There was no point in denial. Mora had lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by simple misdirection. You see much from your place at the edges, Mora continued. More than you used to see from the center, I think. It wasn't an accusation. If anything, Kira heard curiosity in the elder's voice, perhaps even approval. The edges offer a different view, Kira admitted. When you're not caught in the dance, you can see its patterns. When you're not deafened by the drums, you can hear the subtle rhythms. Mora made a soft sound of understanding. And what patterns do you see? This was the moment Kira could deflect, could protect herself with silence, or she could take a risk. In network theory, we call these bridge moments, opportunities to connect previously separate nodes. They require vulnerability from both parties. I see your worry, Kira said carefully. Every morning when Jort joins a hunt, the way your hand finds that pendant, the one your dead son carved, you fear losing your grandson as you lost his father. Mora's fingers moved unconsciously to the carved bone at her throat. Her son had been killed 2 winters ago, gored by an aurochs during a hunt that should have been routine. Now her grandson faced the same dangers, and statistics in their world were unforgiving. I see Lyra's distraction, Kira continued, committed now to this revelation. Her sister's group hasn't sent smoke signals in half a moon cycle. Unusual for them. She fears something has happened but hasn't voiced it because personal concerns aren't supposed to interfere with group responsibilities. And I see Dren struggle. The hunting returns have been smaller each season. He's considering moving the group to new territory, but the elders resist. He's caught between tradition and necessity, between respect for the old ways and the need for survival. Mora studied her for a long moment. You see all this, yet you say nothing in council. Who would listen? Kira asked without bitterness. My voice carries no weight in council. My presence is tolerated. The scar marks me as unlucky. The injury marks me as weak. Neither inspires confidence. In prehistoric societies, information flow was typically hierarchical. Leaders spoke, others listened. Knowledge moved down established channels. But Kira was inadvertently discovering something revolutionary. That informal networks could move information in ways formal structures couldn't. What if, Mora said slowly, as if testing the words, someone with voice spoke of these things. Someone whose words do carry weight. Kira understood immediately. Mora was offering to be her voice, her connection to the group's power structure. But every offer carried a price. And in return, Kira asked, Mora's smile was knowing. Information flows both ways. Young one, you see patterns from the edge. But there are patterns in the center too, ones that might benefit from outside perspective. Such as, my grandson grows reckless. He takes risks to prove himself, to step out of his father's shadow. I need to know when he pushes too hard, when pride overrides wisdom. The other hunters won't tell me. Reporting on a companion breaks trust. But you see without being seen. This was how it began, not with grand declarations or formal alliances, but with quiet recognition of mutual benefit. Mora needed insights about the group dynamics affecting her family. Kira needed a conduit to influence those dynamics. There's more, Mora added. The council discusses things that affect everyone, but includes only a few voices. If patterns you see could reach the council through me, and if council concerns could reach you, she was proposing a two-way flow of information, a bridge between the formal power structure and the informal observations of the marginalized. It was subversive, possibly dangerous, definitely unprecedented. How will we manage this without drawing attention? Kira asked, her practical mind already working through logistics. Over the following days, they developed a simple system. When Mora sat in a specific spot during evening meals, near the large boulder rather than her usual place by the fire, it meant she had information to share. When Kira left certain stones arranged near the water source, 3 in a line meant urgent, 2 meant worthy of note, 1 meant general interest. It indicated she had observations worth discussing. Modern intelligence networks would recognize this as a dead drop system, but for Kira and Mora, it was simply practical. Open association would raise questions neither wanted to answer. Their first exchange proved the system's worth. Mora shared that Dren was indeed considering relocation, but to contested northern territories where other groups already hunted. This information explained Lyra's anxiety about her sister's group. They were likely already dealing with territorial pressures. Kira reported not just the cave bear signs, but also her observation that several younger hunters were forming a faction around Brack, the ambitious second-in-command. They met after dark, speaking in low voices about new leadership for new challenges. Dangerous thinking, more amused. Divisions like that can tear a group apart. Unless addressed before they solidify, Kira suggested, Brack wants recognition. Given responsibility, he might channel that ambition constructively. You suggest rewarding potential rebellion? I suggest recognizing what drives it. Brack feels overlooked. The young hunters feel unheard. Address the cause and the symptom fades. Mora's eyes sharpened with understanding. Information was valuable, but analysis was priceless. Kira wasn't just reporting what she saw. She was interpreting it, providing context that years at the margins had taught her to recognize. That evening, Mora spoke at the fire circle, weaving stories of past winters and the wisdom of measured decisions. She never mentioned Kira, never revealed her source. But she planted seeds about the value of patient young hunters, about the dangers of contested territories, about how the greatest leaders knew when to share responsibility. Within days, Dren had appointed Brack to lead scouting expeditions, channeling his ambition into productive paths. The relocation plans were put on hold pending more information about territorial situations. The potential crisis dissolved before it could form. Kira watched from her usual place at the edges, but something fundamental had changed. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was influencing. The network had found its first major function, turning scattered information into collective wisdom. But networks, once begun, rarely remain simple. Others were beginning to notice the subtle shifts, the unexpected insights, the problem solved before they fully emerged. Some, like Tam, were grateful. Others, like Brack, were suspicious. And a few, like Core, were curious enough to investigate. The pattern was emerging, threads connecting in ways Kira hadn't anticipated. What had begun as a simple exchange between outcasts was becoming something larger, a new form of social organization that would eventually transform not just their group, but the very nature of human society. But first it would be tested, because every innovation that threatens traditional power structures invites resistance. And resistance, Kira would soon learn, could be far more dangerous than isolation. The approach came from an unexpected source. Core appeared at Kira's flint working site just after dawn, when the light was best for detailed napping, but most of the group still slept. His arrival wasn't accidental. He'd chosen a time when they could speak without observation. "I need your help," he said without preamble, then seemed surprised by his own directness. "That is, I think you might understand something I don't." Kira kept her focus on the blade she was crafting, a technique she perfected for encouraging honest conversation. People spoke more freely when eye contact wasn't demanded. "Sit. Tell me." Core settled cross-legged nearby, his hunter's grace evident even in the simple movement. But there was tension in his shoulders, uncertainty in the way his hands kept moving to his spear and back to his lap. "It's about Syrah," he finally said, and Kira had to suppress a knowing smile. She'd wonder when someone would ask about the group's most skilled gatherer. Syrah was an enigma in their society. At 25 winters, she possessed unmatched knowledge of plants, not just which were edible, but which healed, which poisoned, which could preserve meat or tan hides or ease childbirth. Her value to the group was undeniable, yet she remained unmated, refusing every approach from within the group and from visitors alike. "She refuses everyone," Core continued, frustration bleeding through. "Not just me, Dak, Gren, even that tall hunter from the river group last season. The elders pressure her, but she just withdraws more." In prehistoric societies, pair bonding wasn't just personal. It was political, practical, essential. Alliances between groups, genetic diversity, shared resources, division of labor, all depended on successful pairings. A skilled woman refusing all matches created social tension that rippled through the entire group. "Why tell me?" Kira asked, though she suspected the answer. "Because you notice things." Core's admission came reluctantly, and lately, problems seemed to resolve themselves. Tam's injury, that wasn't really a problem. The bear situation handled before it became dangerous. The tension with Brack that disappeared overnight. He paused, studying her. There are patterns here I can't see, but you can. The network was no longer invisible. People were beginning to sense its presence, even if they couldn't name it. This was both victory and danger. Recognition brought power, but also scrutiny. What do you actually want, Core? Kira set down her tools, giving him her full attention. Syrah's affection, or just an answer to mystery? The question caught him off guard. He was used to wanting things simply: successful hunt, full belly, warm furs. The complexity of his feeling for Syrah didn't fit into such straightforward categories. I both. He struggled with the honesty. She's skilled, intelligent, beautiful in her quiet way. We would make strong children, strengthen the group, but also, I don't understand her. It unsettles me. Everyone else makes sense. She doesn't. This was the vulnerability Kira had been waiting for. Not romantic vulnerability, but intellectual, the admission that understanding mattered as much as possession. Have you considered, she said carefully, that Syrah's refusals aren't about the suitors at all? Core frowned. What else would they be about? Kira had observed Syrah carefully over the years, seeing what others missed because they were too focused on her marriageable status. She noticed how Syrah brightened when teaching young ones about plants, her whole demeanor changing from withdrawn to animated, how she created elaborate systems for storing and organizing her gathered medicines, far more complex than simple preservation required. The quiet pride when her remedies worked, saving lives that would have been lost, and most tellingly, the fear in her eyes whenever marriage was mentioned. Not the shyness of a modest woman, but the deep terror of someone facing real loss. Tell me, Kira said, what happens to a woman's work when she pairs? She continues it, but also tend the hearth, raises children. Core's voice trailed off as understanding began to dawn. Syrah has spent 20 winters building knowledge that exists nowhere but in her mind, Kira explained. Every plant, every cure, every seasonal variation, every interaction between herbs. She can't write it down. We have no writing. She can't preserve in stone. Plants are ephemeral. The only storage is memory, and memory dies. She let that sink in before continuing. What happens to that knowledge if she dies in childbirth? If she's too busy with infants to gather, to experiment, to teach? How many generations of accumulated wisdom disappear because one woman fulfills her duty to pair and breed? The anthropological record shows us that specialized knowledge in prehistoric societies was incredibly fragile. Without writing, expertise died with its holders, and childbirth was dangerous, perhaps fatal in one of every 4 cases. She's protecting the knowledge, Core breathed, but the elders don't see it that way, because no one's explained it in terms they understand. Kira picked up her flint again, using the rhythmic work to pace her thoughts. Knowledge preservation isn't valued like hunting success or fertility, but what if it was? This was network thinking at its most sophisticated, not just moving information, but reframing it, changing the conversation itself. How? Core asked, leaning forward. Stories, Kira said simply. The elders respond to stories. What if Morris spoke about the winter her mother died before passing on the cure for lung fever? 3 children lost that season because one woman's knowledge died with her. What if old Dak mentioned how his father's hunting grounds were forgotten when he died young, taking 2 seasons to rediscover them? Stories of loss, Core understood, make them feel the danger. Then, Kira continued, someone could suggest something new. A formal role, knowledge keeper. Someone whose primary duty is preserving and teaching what we know. Honor like a hunter or elder, but free from other obligations. The idea was radical. Prehistoric societies had roles, but they were based on immediate survival needs. Creating a position for information preservation was a conceptual leap that would normally take generations. But the network could accelerate such changes by coordinating multiple voices toward a single goal. If such a role existed, Core said slowly, Syrah could fill it without the pressure to pair. Her knowledge would be protected. And, Kira added with subtle emphasis, Such a keeper would need assistance. Young people to learn, to help organize. Perhaps even a hunter who could escort her to distant gathering sites, protect her during dangerous collections. For the first time in their conversation, Core smiled. You're suggesting I court her mind before her body. I'm suggesting that understanding someone's true needs is the beginning of any real connection. Sarah doesn't refuse suitors because she dislikes companionship. She refuses because accepting means losing who she is. Change what acceptance means, and she let him complete the thought. This was how the network functioned best. Not by dictating solutions, but by providing perspectives that let people find their own answers. How do I contribute to this change? Core asked. I'm just one hunter. You're one hunter who talks to other hunters, who has cousins in visiting groups, who sits at the fire and can wonder aloud about plant knowledge that might be lost. Kira smiled slightly. Networks don't require grand gestures. They require many small voices speaking similar truths until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Core left with purpose in stride, but not before pausing at the edge of her work area. This network of yours, he said quietly. How does one join? The question marked a crucial evolution. The network was no longer something Kira was building. It was something others wanted to be part of. By seeing clearly and sharing wisely, she answered. By understanding that information shared multiplies rather than diminishes. By choosing connection over isolation. He nodded and departed, leaving Kira to contemplate this new development. For active nodes now, herself, Mora, Tam, and Core, each bringing different perspectives, different access, different skills. But more importantly, each node was beginning to create their own connections. Tam had started sharing hunting observations with other young men, creating an informal information exchange among the apprentices. Mora was carefully seeding council discussions with insights that seemed to arise naturally from elder wisdom. And now Core would begin building support for a new concept that could transform how their society valued knowledge. That evening, she met Mora at their usual spot. The elder listened to the day's development with interest that bordered on delight. For active nodes, Mora mused. Plus Sarah, though she doesn't know it yet. And each node connects to others, Tam to the young hunters, Core to the established ones, myself to the elders. It's spreading faster than expected, Kira admitted. I'm not sure I can manage all these connections alone. Mora smiled, the expression making her look years younger. But that's the beauty of it, dear one. You don't have to. Networks manage themselves once they reach a certain size. Each connection creates more connections. Each solved problem builds trust the next. She was right, but Kira couldn't shake a growing unease. In a society built on hierarchy and tradition, they were creating something fundamentally different, something that moved information and influence in unprecedented ways. What happens when those in power notice? Kira asked, when they realize decisions are being influenced by something they don't control? Mora's expression sobered. Then we learn whether the network is strong enough to survive opposition, whether connection can overcome tradition. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge. Somewhere in the camp, Core was probably beginning his campaign to reframe Sarah's value. Tam was sharing observations with his peers. The network lived in these moments, in these choices to connect rather than compete. But in the shadows of the cave, other eyes were watching. Brack had noticed the patterns too, how his ambitious plans had been deflected, how information seemed to flow in new ways. He'd been given responsibility, yes, but he wasn't foolish enough to think it was coincidence. And Brack, unlike the others, saw the network not as opportunity, but as threat. Change always invites resistance. And resistance, when it comes from those with power to lose, can be fierce indeed. The confrontation came during the evening meal, unexpected and public. The entire group had gathered around the central fire, sharing the day's modest catch. 2 deer and various gathered plants. Enough to satisfy, but not to celebrate. The mood was quiet, contemplative, until Dren stood. The leader's scarred hands clenched at his sides as he surveyed the group. His eyes, usually warm despite the hardships of leadership, were cold as the mountain streams. When his gaze found Kira across the fire, she knew the network's hidden period had ended. There are whispers, he began, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. Whispers of decisions being influenced, of information moving through unusual channels. The cave fell silent. Even the children sensed the tension, pressing closer to their mothers. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like tiny prayers for peace. We have ways, Dren continued. Ancient ways passed down from the first hunters. The council speaks. The group listens. The hunters report to me. The gatherers to Ola. This is how it has always been. This is how we survive. Behind him, Kira noticed Brack nodding vigorously. So that was how this had come about. Brack had lost status when his faction dissolved, when his ambitions were redirected. He'd figured out why and gone to Dren with his suspicions. Yet now, Dren's voice hardened, I hear of knowledge passed in darkness, of problems solved by whispers instead of counsel, of an outcast building influence through secrets. The last word hung in the air like a thrown spear. In prehistoric societies, secrets were dangerous. They suggested hidden agendas, potential betrayal. The group's survival depended on transparent loyalty, on knowing where each member stood. Kira felt the weight of eyes upon her. Some curious, some hostile, many simply confused. This was the moment she'd feared, when the informal network collided with formal power. But before she could respond, Tam stood. At 13 Winters, he barely had the right to speak at gathering, but his voice was steady and clear. I injured my ankle, he announced. Too proud to admit it, too foolish to seek help. Kira saw what I tried to hide. She helped me heal without shame. Is observation a secret? Is kindness conspiracy? A murmur ran through the group. Dren frowned, but before he could respond, more arose with Elder's privilege. The bare signs were seen by many, she said mildly. Young eyes noticed them first. Old memory gave them meaning. Is sharing wisdom across generations now forbidden? And Syrah's knowledge? Kor added, standing as well. Should we lose it to tradition when innovation could preserve it? The Knowledge Keeper role strengthens us all. One by one, members of the network stood, not in defiance, but in explanation. Each told their small story, of problem solved, of information shared, of connections that had benefited everyone. Modern social theory calls this network activation, when loose connections suddenly solidify in response to external pressure. But for Dren, it looked like something else entirely. A parallel power structure he hadn't seen forming. His jaw tightened. You speak of help, of wisdom. But what I see is influence without accountability. Decisions guided by those who bear no responsibility for outcomes. This was the crux of it. In hierarchical societies, power and responsibility were inextricably linked. Leaders who made bad decisions faced consequences, loss of status, replacement, sometimes exile. But informal networks operated differently, with influence distributed and therefore harder to punish. Kira finally stood. The fire crackled between her and Dren, casting shifting shadows on the cave walls where their ancestors had painted stories of survival. She thought of those ancestors, of the first person to suggest using fire, to propose hunting in groups, to imagine painting stories on stone. Every innovation had faced resistance. You're right, she said, surprising everyone, including herself. I have influence without authority, guided without being chosen. She paused, meeting the eyes of those around the fire. But I have never guided toward harm. Every whisper, every connection, has been for the group's survival. That you decide, Dren countered. You alone judge what helps or harms. No, Kira shook her head. The network decides. Information flows, but action remains with individuals. Tam chose to accept help. Mora chose to share wisdom. Kor chose to value knowledge. I merely connected. She saw Lyra lean forward, interested despite herself. Others were listening now, really listening, perhaps hearing the concept for the first time. In the hunt, Kira continued, does the tracker who finds spoor claim the kill? Does the beater who drives prey take credit for the spear thrust? We survive through connection, through each role supporting others. The network is simply a new kind of hunt for solutions instead of meat. It was an analogy they could understand. Hunting was sacred, complex, requiring multiple roles working in harmony. If information flow could be seen the same way, Dren studied her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, merely one bound by tradition. And even he could see the results. The injuries healed quietly, the conflict resolved, the knowledge preserved. And if this network guides us wrong, he asked, who do we blame? Who do we punish? It was a fair question. Networks distributed benefits, but also diffused responsibility. In a world where mistakes could mean death, accountability mattered. But it was Sarah who answered, speaking publicly for the first time in moons. When winter came early 3 years ago, who do we blame? When the herds moved, who did we punish? We adapted. We survived. We learned. She stood gracefully, her gatherer's knowledge giving her quiet authority. The network isn't replacing leadership. It's adding resilience. The anthropological record shows us that human groups succeed through flexibility, not rigidity. The ability to adapt structures to meet new challenges. But living through such adaptation is always uncomfortable. Dren looked around the fire circle, reading the group's mood with the skill that had made him leader. He saw fear in some faces, interest in others, but no real opposition to what had emerged. Then let it be witnessed, he said finally, his voice formal. This network exists not to replace our ways, but to supplement them. His eyes found Kira again. But if it guides us to harm, those who we will answer for it. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was recognition, official acknowledgement that something new had emerged in their midst. The network was no longer shadow, but substance. As the gathering dispersed, people moved differently. Small groups formed and reformed, conversations sparked by new connections. The invisible threads Kira had begun weaving were becoming visible, acknowledged, real. But visibility brought vulnerability. And in the darkness beyond the fire's reach, Brack watched with calculating eyes. If influence could flow through new channels, perhaps those channels could be corrupted. If the network could strengthen the group, perhaps it could also weaken it. The tool that connected could also divide. The same threads that bound could strangle. The network had survived its first challenge. The real test was yet to come. The false information entered the network like poison in a stream, so subtle that its danger wasn't immediately apparent. It started with truth, which made it harder to detect. Brack had learned from his earlier mistakes. Instead of opposing the network directly, he decided to use it. He approached Tam one morning with what seemed like valuable information. I saw signs yesterday, he said casually, helping the boy prepare spears for morning hunt. Deer moving through the eastern passes. Earlier than usual. The tracks were fresh. It was partially true. Brack had seen old tracks, weathered by at least a week of rain and wind. But he described them as fresh, knowing Tam's eagerness to prove his value to the network would overcome his still developing tracking skills. Tam, trusting in the network's principles of information sharing, passed it along. Within 2 days, the early migration was being discussed as fact. Core was adjusting hunting plans. Moore was advising families to prepare preserved foods differently. The network hummed with activity based on false premises. Kira noticed a distortion by accident. She'd been observing the actual eastern passes for her own reasons, watching weather patterns, noting which plants grew in the wind-protected valleys. She found no signs of unusual movement, no fresh tracks, no browse lines on vegetation that would indicate recent grazing. The discovery chilled her more than any winter wind. The network had a weakness she hadn't anticipated. In formal hierarchies, information came with sources attached. When Dren spoke, everyone knew it was Dren's word, Dren's reputation at stake. But in the network, information flowed through multiple nodes, sources becoming obscured, authority distributed and therefore diluted. She tracked the information back carefully, a skill she developed through moons of pattern watching. The story had changed with each telling. Tam had said Brack saw fresh deer signs. Core heard, deer are definitely moving early. By the time it reached the planning discussions, it had become the herds have shifted patterns, confirmed by multiple observations. Modern network theory has a term for this: Byzantine fault. When nodes in a network can't distinguish between correct and corrupted information, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Trust, the network's greatest strength, was also its greatest weakness. Kira called an emergency gathering, not of the whole group, but of the network's core nodes. They met at the overlook above camp, where privacy and perspective aligned. The wind carried away their words, ensuring no unwanted ears could listen. "We have a problem," she began without preamble. "False information has entered the network." Deliberately, she explained what she'd discovered. The faces around her showed a progression of understanding, surprise, anger, then deep worry. "If we act on false deer migration," Core's voice trailed off. Every hunter knew the consequence. Wasted energy searching empty grounds. Missed opportunities in actual hunting areas. Potential starvation when winter stores proved inadequate. "Brack played us." Tam's young voice was bitter. "Used my trust." "No," Kira corrected gently. "He used the network's trust." That's different and more dangerous. Because it wasn't just about one false report. If information could be corrupted at any node, if trust could be weaponized, then the entire network became suspect. People would stop sharing, stop connecting, retreat into isolation. The network would die not from external attack, but from internal doubt. How do we stop it? Mora asked, ever practical. We can't verify everything. That defeats the network's purpose. And we can't simply exclude Brack, Core added. He's shown that information can be corrupted at any point, through any person. They sat in uncomfortable silence. Below them, the camp went about its evening routines, unaware that their new system of connection faced its first existential crisis. Syrah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "When I gather medicinal plants, I don't just look at the plant itself. I note where it grows, what season, what other plants around it. Context matters as much as content." Kira found herself thinking about trust. How it was built, how it was destroyed, how it could be rebuilt stronger. In the network, trust wasn't just personal but systemic. They needed a way to maintain it, without losing the network's flexibility. "What if," she said slowly, "we add context to our information? Not just what we learn, but how we learned it." The others looked puzzled. The concept of metadata wouldn't be formalized for millennia, but the instinct was there. When someone shares information, they share its source. Brack observed deer signs instead of "deer are moving early." The information carries its origin. "But Brack shared through me," Tam protested. "My reputation would suffer for his lie. Unless you were clear about the source. Your reputation would be for accurate transmission, not for the truth of what you transmit." Kira picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt. "Look, information flows like water. We need to know not just where it goes, but where it came from." She drew circles representing people, lines showing information flow. If each piece of information carries its source, patterns emerge. Someone who consistently provides false information becomes visible. Someone who accurately transmits but doesn't verify also becomes known. We build different types of trust. Like hunting roles, Core understood. The tracker who finds signs, the scout who verifies them, the leader who decides to act. Each has different responsibilities. Exactly. The network doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be transparent about its imperfections. They spent the remaining daylight developing their new protocol. Information would flow, but with attribution. Repeated accuracy would build reputation. Patterns of false or misleading information would be noticed, remembered, adapted to. It wasn't perfect. No system ever was. But it was resilient. The next morning, Kira made a point of publicly asking Brack about his deer observations. Her questions were specific, which passes exactly. What age were the deer based on track size? What was the stride length indicating speed of travel? His discomfort was obvious as he tried to maintain the lie under direct scrutiny. When pressed for details, his story crumbled. He'd seen old signs and interpreted them optimistically. Interpretation is valuable, Kira said mildly, letting him save some face. But it should be shared as interpretation, not observation. The network needs both, but clearly labeled. The incident became a teaching moment. The group learned to distinguish between direct observation, I saw, Interpretation, I think this means. Transmitted information, I heard from X that. Speculation, it's possible that. Each type had value, but mixing them caused confusion and enabled corruption. But the incident left scars. Trust, once absolute, now carried caution. Information, once freely given, now came with careful attribution. The network was stronger for surviving the test, but also more complex. And complexity, Kira was learning, had its own price. That night, as she worked her flint by firelight, Dren approached. The leader moved with the quiet confidence of a predator, but his expression was thoughtful rather than threatening. Your network survived Brack's test, he observed. You knew. A slight smile. Leaders must understand all currents in their group. Brack's resentment was obvious. I wonder how your system would handle corruption. Kira felt a flash of anger. You let it happen? I let the network prove itself, as I let formal leadership prove itself daily. He settled beside her, the firelight making him seem both older and younger. You created something new, Kira, but newness must be tested. She couldn't argue with the logic, even as she resented the method. And your verdict? It adapts. It learns. It strengthens through challenge. He picked up a piece of her work flint, examining the edge. Like good tool-making, pressure creates sharpness. They sat in companionable silence, leader and network weaver. Understanding flowed between them without words. The network hadn't replaced hierarchy. It had created a parallel system that could strengthen or challenge traditional power as needed. What happens to Brack? Kira asked eventually. He hunts alone for a time. Trust, once broken, requires effort to rebuild. Dren's voice carried the weight of judgment in any system. He stood to leave, then paused. The network changes things. Not just how we share information, but how we think about truth itself. Be careful with that power. After he left, Kira continued working, but her mind was on his words. Power. She'd never thought of the network as power, just as connection. But Dren was right. The ability to shape how information flowed, how decisions were influenced, how problems were solved, that was power indeed. And power, she knew from watching leaders, corrupted as easily as information. The network had survived external corruption. Could it survive the internal corruption that power might bring? The smoke signals from the northern hills had been wrong for days. Where usually Lyra's sister group sent up steady plumes at midday, 1 for all is well, 2 for visitors approaching, 3 for help needed. Now came irregular puffs that followed no pattern anyone recognized. Lyra's anxiety had infected the entire camp. She performed her gathering duties mechanically, her usual expertise with plants replaced by distracted fumbling. She'd mistaken bitter root for edible tuber twice, errors that could have been dangerous if others hadn't caught them. My sister, she confided to Syrah during a gathering expedition. Something's wrong. I know it, but the elders say we must wait for the full moon gathering, 6 days away. Traditional protocol was clear. Intergroup contact happened at prescribed times, for good reason. Resources were scarce, territories carefully negotiated. Disease could spread between groups. Conflicts could escalate. The full moon gatherings provided neutral ground, ritual protection, structured interaction. But the network operated on different principles. What if, Syrah suggested carefully, there was a way to communicate without meeting? That evening, the network's core members gathered again. Lyra had been invited, her need overcoming the usual careful approach to new members. She sat nervously at the edge of the circle, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. Tell us about your sister, Kira said gently, about how you communicated as children. The question seemed to surprise Lyra. She'd expected strategy, not nostalgia. But as she began to speak, understanding dawned. Naya and I were inseparable as children, she said. Before my family joined this group, when we lived by the river, we created our own language, not spoken, but visual. Bent reeds by the water, arranged stones, marks in mud. Could smoke carry similar patterns? Mora asked, not complex messages. But Lyra's eyes brightened. We had simple signals. Sharp angles meant danger. Curves meant safety. Spirals meant meet me. If I could control the smoke precisely enough. This was network thinking at its finest, taking existing connections and reimagining them. Not creating new channels, but repurposing old ones with new understanding. They spent the night experimenting. Tam and Core gathered specific woods that burned with different smoke densities. Sarah contributed plant materials that changed smoke colors subtly, dried moss for white, certain barks for darker smoke. Moore suggested timing patterns based on heartbeats, something both sisters would instinctively understand. The technical challenge was significant. Controlling smoke required precise management of fire, wind consideration, and patient observation. But the network had something traditional society didn't: multiple minds working on a single problem, each contributing their expertise. By dawn, they had a system. Not complex enough for detailed messages, but sufficient for basic communication. Quick puffs followed by steady stream. Are you safe? Alternating thick and thin. Need help? Spiral pattern made with a hide fan. Meet at traditional place. Color variations to indicate type of problem. White for illness, dark for danger. Lyra's first attempts were clumsy, emotion making her hands shake. But Kira guided her, the same calm presence she developed through years of observation, serving now to steady another's nerves. The modified smoke rose in the morning air. 2 quick puffs, pause, long stream, pause, spiral created by careful fanning. To any observer, it looked like a poorly maintained fire. To Naya, if she remembered their childhood codes, it would mean, are you safe? Send signal. They waited. The morning stretched into afternoon. Lyra's hope began to fade. Perhaps her sister had forgotten. Perhaps she wasn't even alive to see the signals. Then, just as the sun touched the western peaks, smoke rose from the north. Irregular, stuttering, but with a pattern. Short burst, long stream, short, short. Lyra gasped, tears streaming down her face. Sick, many sick, need help. The network erupted into quiet action. But it wasn't the chaotic scramble of emergency. It was coordinated, purposeful. This was what the network did best, turning individual knowledge into collective action. Sarah immediately began gathering medicinal plants, focusing on those that treated fever and lung ailments, the most common group illnesses. But she didn't work alone. She shared her knowledge with others, teaching them to identify the plants, explaining the preparations. Information that had been hoarded was now distributed. Core started planning the fastest route north, one that avoided territorial markers and traditional boundaries. But he too shared his thinking, explaining to younger hunters how to read landscape for safe passage, how to move without leaving traces that might alarm other groups. Moore went to work on Dren and the council, not asking for permission but planting seeds of concern. If illness spreads between groups, we'll face it unprepared at the gathering. Better to send medicine now. Maintain distance but show good faith. But it was Kira who thought beyond the immediate crisis. This connection, she told Lyra, it doesn't end with this emergency. Your sister's group has knowledge we don't. Plants that grow in their territory, hunting patterns we haven't seen, weather observations from their elevation, and we have the same for them. She was proposing something unprecedented. Regular information exchange between groups, not through formal gatherings, but through network connections. The elders will resist, Lyra said, but her voice carried hope rather than defeat. At first, but if exchange brings benefit. Kira let the implication hang. Within 2 days, a solution had been crafted. Medicine couldn't be directly delivered. That would violate territorial boundaries. But it could be left at a neutral location both groups knew. A small cave at the territorial border, used sometimes for ritual exchanges. Sarah prepared detailed instructions, using symbols that were universal among groups. Circle for sun, indicating day. Crescents for moon phases, indicating time. Simple plant drawings. Even if specific preparation methods weren't clear, the basic uses would be understood. The package was left at dawn. By evening, it was gone. The next day, smoke signals from the north showed a different pattern. Steady streams with occasional variations. Not emergency, but communication. Lyra translated. Medicine received. Helping. Gratitude. But the real change came over the following weeks. The smoke signals continued, becoming more sophisticated. Naya's group had indeed found new plant varieties in their mountain territory. They had observed weather patterns, how clouds formed differently before snow versus rain, knowledge crucial for planning. In exchange, Lyra's group shared Syrah's medicinal knowledge and Kor's innovative hunting techniques. Information flowed across invisible bridges, strengthening both communities without requiring physical contact. The concept of intergroup networks wouldn't be formally recognized by anthropologists for millennia, but humans have always found ways to connect across boundaries when connection serves survival. More importantly, the connection changed how both groups thought about each other. The northern group went from strangers who might compete for resources to neighbors who share knowledge. The smoke signals created familiarity without contact, cooperation without merger. Young people in both groups began learning the smoke patterns. What started as emergency communication evolved into regular exchange. Children who would someday lead grew up thinking of the other group not as potential enemies, but as distant nodes in an extended network. "You've changed us," Dren told Kira one evening, his voice carrying something between accusation and admiration. "Not just how we share information, but how we think about others. The world grows larger when connections span distance." He was right. The network had started as a way for an outcast to find belonging within a group, but it had become something larger, a new form of social organization that transcended traditional boundaries. Yet with expansion came new challenges. More nodes meant more complexity. Greater distance meant weaker verification. And not everyone celebrated the changes. Brack, still isolated from his deception, watched the smoke signals with calculating eyes. If networks could connect groups, perhaps they could also divide them. If information could heal, perhaps misinformation could destroy on a larger scale. He began to plan, not just to corrupt the network, but to turn it against itself, to make connection a liability rather than strength. The network's greatest test was approaching, and this time it wouldn't come from simple false information, but from something far more dangerous. Truth used as a weapon. The crisis began with Brack's redemption, which made it infinitely more dangerous. After weeks of isolation, he approached Tam with what appeared to be genuine humility. His shoulders were slumped, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked like shame. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about the deer tracks, about trying to manipulate the network. I see now what you're building. I want to help." Tam, young and idealistic, wanted to believe in redemption. The network had taught him that connection could heal, that information shared could build trust. Why not forgiveness? What changed? Tam asked, cautious but not dismissive. "Hunting alone," Brack replied. "It gives you time to think, to see your mistakes, and..." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I found something that could help the group. I want to share it correctly this time." He led Tam to a salt lick 2 days' journey from camp. It was real, rich deposits that could preserve meat through winter, a discovery of genuine value. Tam verified it carefully, remembering the lessons about source attribution. The salt was exactly where Brack described, exactly as valuable as claimed. Trust, cautiously, began to rebuild. But Brack had learned from his earlier failure. He understood now that the network valued truth. So he gave him truth, selective truth, weaponized truth. Over the following days, he shared more accurate information. A water source that stayed unfrozen in winter. A sheltered valley where small game concentrated during storms. Each piece verified, each valuable. His reputation within the network slowly recovered. Then casually he mentioned to Tam, "I saw signs near the salt lick. Human signs. Recent." It was true. He had seen signs, his own, carefully placed to be discovered. "The northern group knows about the salt," he added. "Their hunters were scouting near there last week." This too was partially true. Northern hunters did sometimes range that far, though not recently. But the seed was planted. Tam, trusting the now reliable Brack, passed the information along. But in the transmission, nuance was lost. Northern hunters near the Salt Lick became northern groups scouting our discovery, became their planning to claim it. Modern information theory calls this cascade failure, when small distortions amplify through repeated transmission, like an avalanche that starts with a single shifted pebble. By the time the information reached Lyra through the network, her sister's group wasn't just aware of the salt. They were actively planning to secure it before winter. The smoke signals that had carried cooperation now carried suspicion. Why didn't you tell us about the salt? Lyra's signals asked. Naya's confused response, what salt? Was interpreted not as ignorance but as deception. Within days, both groups were eyeing the valuable resource with possession rather than potential sharing. Hunters from both groups began ranging toward the salt lick, careful to avoid each other, but clearly establishing presence. The network that had connected them now carried distrust with the same efficiency it had carried cooperation. Worse, because the information was essentially true, there was a salt lick, it was valuable, both groups did need it. The corruption was harder to identify. Kira watched the deterioration with growing alarm. She tried to trace the source, but Brack had been clever. Each piece of information he'd shared was technically accurate. The distortion came from implication, from the spaces between facts, from the human tendency to fill gaps with fear rather than hope. She called an emergency gathering of the network's core members. They met at night this time, the darkness matching their mood. We're losing them, Lyra said, her voice thick with unshed tears. My sister thinks we've been hiding resources. I think they've been scouting our territory. The trust is breaking. It's Brack, Tam said miserably. It has to be. But I verified everything he said. The salt is real. The signs were real. Reality can lie. Mora observed. Truth without context is often more dangerous than falsehood. They sat in uncomfortable silence. The network faced a crisis deeper than simple corruption. How could they filter not just false information, but manipulative truth? How could they maintain connection when suspicion proved as contagious as trust? Maybe the network was a mistake, Kor said, voicing what others were thinking. Maybe traditional ways exist for a reason. Clear hierarchies, formal meetings, established protocols. They're slower but safer. It was the darkest moment since the network's inception. Members began withdrawing, limiting their sharing, reverting to old patterns of isolated knowledge. The connections that had taken months to build were unraveling in days. Kira found herself truly alone for the first time since creating the network. Not the familiar isolation of the outcast, but the sharper loneliness of lost connection. She'd tasted belonging, had built something larger than herself, and now watched it crumble. But in that solitude, clarity emerged. The network's weakness wasn't connection. It was treating all information equally. They'd added source attribution after Brack's first deception, but they hadn't considered the deeper problem of context and intention. They'd built a system for moving information, but not for understanding its purpose. She spent the night thinking, drawing patterns in the dirt, visualizing the network's flows. By dawn, she had an idea. Not a perfect solution, but a possibility. She called one last gathering. Only Mora and Tam came at first, loyalty outlasting disappointment. Slowly, others trickled in, curiosity overcoming caution. We failed, Kira began, which surprised them. They'd expected defense or solutions, not admission. I failed. I built a system for moving information, but not for understanding its purpose. She drew patterns in the dirt, visual representation of the network's flows. Look at how the Salt Lick story moved. Each node added their own fears, their own assumptions. By the time it reached decision makers, it wasn't Brack's manipulation anymore, it was our collective anxiety. So we're to blame? Lyra asked, pain evident in her voice. No, we're human. We interpret, we assume, we fill gaps with our own experience. The network amplifies this, both good and bad. Kira met each of their eyes. But we can build better filters. She proposed something radical. Network roles beyond simple connection. Verifiers, people who specialize in checking facts, visiting sites, confirming observations. Bridges, dedicated communicators between groups who maintain context and fought assumption. Pattern watchers, members who look for cascade failures, who notice when information was gaining dangerous momentum. Context keepers, Those who ensured information carried not just facts but circumstances, intentions, implications. Complexity on complexity, more observed. Can we maintain such a system? Can we afford not to? Sarah countered. She'd been quiet through the crisis, but her healer's mind understood. A body has different systems: blood flow, breath, digestion. Each serves its purpose. Why should a social body be simpler? It took time. Trust, once broken, rebuilt slowly. But the Salt Lick crisis had taught them valuable lessons. Information needed context. Connection required intention. Networks could be resilient only if they evolved to meet challenges. The solution came from an unexpected source: the children. While adults struggled with complex protocols, young ones created simple games that taught network principles. Truth tag. Being caught meant sharing something real about yourself, but also explaining why it mattered. Connection webs. Using actual thread to show how messages traveled and changed, making visible how distortion happened. Source stones. Each piece of information came with a physical token, showing its origin and type. Through play, the next generation internalized what the first had discovered through pain. That networks were powerful but required wisdom to wield. The Salt Lick, in the end, was shared, not through grand gesture, but through children's logic. At the autumn gathering, young ones from both groups played with their source stones, naturally trading information about preservation techniques. Their parents watched, remembering their own childhood games, and realized what the network had always been about: not just information, but connection. Not just efficiency, but understanding. Brack's manipulation had failed in its intent to destroy, but succeeded in forcing evolution. The network that emerged was stronger, wiser, more complex. It had learned to fail without failing completely, to adapt without abandoning core principles. But one more lesson remained, the hardest of all, because Brack, watching his second failure, began to understand something crucial. The network's greatest strength wasn't its ability to share information or solve problems. It was its ability to create identity, to make people feel part of something larger. An identity, he realized, could be the ultimate weapon. Winter arrived early that year, as the bear signs had predicted. The network had helped both groups prepare, shared knowledge of preservation techniques, coordinated hunting to avoid waste, distributed medicinal plants before snow made gathering impossible. But winter brought another challenge. Long nights in close quarters, where every tension magnified, every small conflict echoed off cave walls. The network, designed for information flow, struggled with the emotional density of confined living. It was during the coldest night, when even the fire seemed to shrink from the dark, that Brack made his final move. But this time, he didn't attack the network directly. He attacked what it had created, the sense of shared identity that crossed traditional boundaries. He began by telling stories. Not lies, but selective truths. "Remember when we hunted alone," he said during a particularly scarce evening, when the shared meal was meager. Each family's success was their own. Now we share with groups we've never met, based on smoke signals and children's games. It wasn't false. The network had created obligations, expectations of sharing that didn't exist before. When the northern groups signaled need, resources flowed northward. When southern traders mentioned scarcity, knowledge of new hunting grounds was shared. We become servants to distant needs, Brack continued another night. Our children learn smoke signals before they master spear work. Our gatherers seek plan for others before filling our own stores. Again, threads of truth. The network had changed priorities, shifted focus from purely local concerns to broader connections. Children did spend time learning communication systems. Resources were shared based on network connections rather than traditional kinship. Who are we becoming? Brack asked, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. Are we still the cave bear people, or have we become something else? Something without roots, without tradition? This was his masterstroke. Not attacking the network's function, but questioning its effect on identity. In a world where group identity meant survival, where knowing who you were determined how you acted, the question cut deep. The doubt spread faster than any false information could have. People began to notice how much had changed. The evening fires that once featured ancient stories now included network updates. The skills valued had shifted from pure survival to communication and connection. Even the language was evolving, with new words for concepts that hadn't existed before. "My son wants to be a bridge," one mother complained. "Not a hunter, not a craftsman, a bridge. What kind of life is that?" "My daughter spends more time learning plant symbols for distant groups than gathering for us," another added. The network, which had solved so many problems, seemed helpless against this one. How could they address fears about identity loss when those fears were partially justified? The network had changed them, was changing them still. Kira found herself facing the deepest challenge yet. Technical problems had technical solutions. Trust could be rebuilt with protocols. But identity? How did you balance innovation with tradition? Connection with distinctiveness? She sought out the oldest members of the group, those who remembered times before even the current traditions. What she learned surprised her. "We weren't always a cave bear people," Ancient Cost told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother remembered when we were the river salmon folk, changed when the river dried, became mountain people, learned new ways." "Identity shifts," added old Mira, not Mora, but her age namesake. "What matters is the shifting serve survival. Does your network serve survival?" The question haunted Kira. Did the network serve survival, or had it become something that existed for its own sake? Had connection become more important than the people it connected? She called a different kind of gathering, not of network nodes, but of the entire group. And she didn't speak of information, or connection, or solutions. She spoke of story. "Who remembers the first fire?" she began. "Not the first fire here, but the first fire ever? The ancestor who saw lightning strike and thought, 'I could carry that warmth?'" Heads nodded. Everyone knew some version of the tale. Were they still people after they carried fire, or did they become something new? She let the question hang. What about the first spear? The first spoken word? The first time someone drew on stone? Each change changed us. Each tool made us more and less than we were before. She looked around the circle, meeting eyes both friendly and hostile. The network is a tool. Like fire, like language. It changes us, yes, but we remain who we choose to be. "Pretty words," Brack interjected. "But who chooses? When the network says share, we share. When distant groups need, we provide. Where's our choice?" It was a fair challenge, and Kira had been thinking about it. "You're right," she said, surprising him. "The network has grown beyond tool to become identity, and that's dangerous. Any identity that excludes others weakens us." She stood, moving to the cave wall where ancient paintings told stories of survival. "Look at these. Hunt scenes, yes, but also ceremonies, gatherings. Connection has always been part of who we are. The network just makes it visible. But it needs boundaries," she continued. "Times when we are fully cave bear people, focus on our own traditions. Times when we are network nodes, connected to others. Balance, not replacement." She proposed something new, seasonal rhythms for the network. During certain moons, it would be fully active, sharing, connecting, solving. During others, it would be quiet, allowing groups to focus inward, to strengthen their own identities. Like hunting and gathering, Core understood. Times for going out, times for staying home. Like breathing, Syrah added. In and out, both necessary. The proposal wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it acknowledged the real fear Brack had exploited. That connection could mean loss of self. By creating rhythm, they protected both innovation and tradition. But Kira wasn't done. She turned to Brack directly. "You've tested the network 3 times, she said. With lies, with corrupted truth, with identity fears. Each time, you've made it stronger. Perhaps it's time to stop testing and start building. You want me to join what I've tried to destroy. I want you to join what you've helped create. Your challenges forced evolution. Your resistance created resilience. The network needs skeptics as much as believers. Will you be our first challenger? The one who tests ideas before they spread, who finds weaknesses before they break." It was a radical offer, turning the network's greatest enemy into essential component. But it followed network logic, connection over isolation. inclusion over exclusion. Brack stood silent for long moments. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across cave walls where generations had gathered, changed, survived. A challenger, he said finally, one who questions but doesn't destroy, who strengthens through doubt. He nodded slowly. Perhaps opposition and support aren't opposites after all. The crisis passed, but its lessons remained. The network learned to balance connection with identity, create rhythms of engagement and withdrawal, include skepticism as essential function, recognize that change and tradition could coexist. That winter was remembered not for its cold, but for its transformation. Stories were told of both ancient ways and new connections. Children learned traditional skills and network protocols. Identity became not either slash or but both slash and. But one more chapter remained in the network's origin, because creation is never complete until the creator steps back and lets the creation live independently. For Kira, that time was approaching. 25 years had passed since a scarred woman first sat at the edge of her group and imagined connection. Kira's hair was gray now, her movements careful with age, but her eyes remained sharp, still seeing patterns others missed. She sat at the edge of another group, in another cave, by another fire. But this time, she wasn't alone. Around her sat young people from 7 different tribes, gathered for what had become an annual tradition, the network teaching. What had started as emergency information sharing had evolved into something their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Intentional, multi-group education. Tell us again, urged Syl, a bright-eyed girl whose quick mind reminded Kira of her younger self. Tell us how it really began. Kira smiled, the expression pulling at the ancient scar that had started everything. It began with seeing, with being pushed to the edges and discovering that the edges offered the clearest view. She'd told this story countless times, in countless variations, to countless groups, each telling shaped by the needs of the listeners, the challenges they faced, the connections they struggled to build. The network had taught her that truth wasn't fixed but adaptive, that stories lived through retelling. But the seeing isn't the important part, she continued. Anyone can observe patterns. The revolution was in the sharing, in understanding that information locked in one mind dies with that mind, but information shared multiplies beyond death. Around the fire, young faces absorbed this wisdom. They'd grown up with the network, took its existence for granted. But Kira knew the importance of origin stories, of understanding not just how things work, but why they've been created. Show us the trust web again, another youth requested. Kira pulled out her teaching tools, cords of different colors, stones of various sizes, symbols carved in bone, physical representations of abstract concepts. She'd learned that humans thought better when they could touch ideas. Every connection starts with risk, she began, tying the first knot between 2 cords. Someone shares truth, making themselves vulnerable. Someone else receives it with respect, building trust. The first thread is always the hardest. She added more cords, creating complex patterns that showed how information flowed, how trust built, how corruption could spread and be contained. The young people had seen this demonstration before, but repetition was how deep learning happened. What about distance? Asked Dak, grandson of the Brack who had become the network's first challenger. The boy carried his grandfather's questioning spirit, but without the destructive edge. How do we maintain connection across territories we'll never visit? Kira smiled. It was a good question, one each generation had to solve anew. Distance is overcome by protocol, she explained. Shared symbols, common practices, regular rhythms, but also by stories. When you share not just information, but the context around it, who discovered it, why it matters, how it changes things, you create connection across any distance. She'd built networks in 12 different regions now, each unique, each connected to the others through threads of traded information and shared principles. Some used smoke signals, others used carved message sticks. Still others had developed complex runner systems. The method mattered less than the commitment to connection. Will you stay for the moon gathering? Syl asked hopefully. The far northern groups are coming. You could teach them directly. Kira shook her head gently. My teaching days are ending, but yours are beginning. The network doesn't need me anymore. It needs you. Fresh eyes to see new patterns. Young voices to share new truths. It was hard to say, harder for them to hear. But Kira understood what her own mentor, Mora, had taught her. Networks that depended on single nodes were fragile. True resilience came from distributed knowledge, shared ownership, collective evolution. That night, after the formal teaching ended, Kira sat with the regional bridges, those who maintained connections between distant groups. They shared updates that would have seemed impossible in her youth. The coastal groups have developed new preservation methods using salt and smoke, reported one. They're willing to teach in exchange for inland hunting techniques. The mountain tribes found a way to predict weather changes 3 days out, added another, something about cloud formations and wind patterns. They've created a symbol system to share it. There's conflict brewing between the river peoples, a third noted, fishing rights disputes. But the network is helping them negotiate before violence erupts. Kira listened with quiet satisfaction. This was what she dreamed of but never quite imagined. Not just information sharing, but collective problem solving on a scale that spanned territories vast beyond any one person's travel. What worries you about the network's future? She asked them. It was always her final question, the one that revealed both current challenges and emerging opportunities. Complexity, one bridge admitted. Each group adds their own protocols, their own innovations. Sometimes messages get lost in translation. Speed, said another. Information moves faster than wisdom. By the time we verify something, it's already spread everywhere. Purpose, the third added quietly. Some groups use the network only for advantage, not for mutual benefit. They take, but don't give. Old challenges in new forms. Kira nodded understanding. The network is a living thing, she said. It will always face these tensions between simplicity and sophistication, speed and accuracy, individual and collective benefit. Your job isn't to solve them permanently, but to balance them moment by moment. She stood, her movement signaling the evening's end. But she had one more thing to share. I'm leaving tomorrow, she announced, traveling beyond the known territories. There are groups past the Great Desert who've never heard of networks, who still live in complete isolation. Protests erupted. She was too old for such journeys. The desert was dangerous. Those groups might be hostile to outsiders. Kira raised a hand for silence. The network began because someone sat at the edges and imagined connection. It spread because people carried it to new edges. That work never ends. She looked at each of them, these carriers of the future. You think the network is established now, safe and stable. But establishment is death for living systems. The network survives by always having edges to grow into, always finding new problems to solve, new connections to make. Young Syl, bold with youth, asked, "What if you don't come back?" "Then I don't come back," Kira said simply. But the network continues. That's the point. I was necessary at the beginning, helpful during growth, but now I'm just one node among thousands. The pattern matters more than any single thread. That night, her last with this group, was spent in celebration. Not of her, she deflected such attempts, but of connection itself. Each person shared a story of how the network had touched their life. Problems solved, relationships formed, knowledge preserved, conflicts avoided. But it was the quiet moment with old Tam that meant the most. The boy she'd first helped was a grandfather now, one of the network's most respected wisdom keepers. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Creating something that took over your life?" Kira considered the question. "I didn't create the network," she said finally. "I discovered it. Connection was always there, waiting. I just made it visible. Still, your whole life spent building, teaching, spreading. Was it worth it?" She thought of her younger self, scarred and isolated, sitting at the edge of the group, of the pain that had driven innovation, the loneliness that had sparked connection. Every thread, she said, every single thread was worth it. The next morning came gray and foggy, the world shrouded in mist that made everything seem possible and nothing certain. Perfect weather for departures. The group gathered to see her off, but Kira's attention was on the children playing network games at the camp's edge. They'd already modified the rules she'd taught, added new elements, made the games their own. The network evolving without conscious thought, as natural as breathing. She walked into fog with the same steady pace she maintained for decades. Behind her, smoke signals rose, carrying news of her journey to distant nodes. Ahead, unknown challenges waited, but she carried with her the certain knowledge that connection, once begun, could not be stopped. Every group she touched now touched others. Every innovation shared sparked new innovations. The network had achieved what she'd barely dared dream. It had become self-sustaining, self-improving, alive in its own right. In her pouch, she carried one final innovation, symbols carved in bone that could prompt memory of network principles. Not quite writing, but a step toward it. Another edge to explore, another pattern to share. The fog swallowed her, but her work continued in every connection made, every truth shared, every moment when someone at the edges saw clearly and chose to weave rather than withdraw. The network lived, not in any single place or person, but in the spaces between, in the choice to share rather than hoard, to connect rather than isolate, to trust rather than fear. And thousands of miles away, in territory she'd never see, a young person sat at the edge of their group, observing patterns, imagining connections, preparing to weave their own threads into the endless web. The echo moved forward through time, unstoppable. You felt it, didn't you? That recognition, that familiar ache when Kira sat at the edge of the group, connected but not included. The thrill when the first connection formed. The anxiety when false information threatened everything. The struggle when identity and innovation clashed. Because 43,000 years later, you're living in Kira's network. Every time you share information online, you're using principles she discovered. When you check sources, build reputation through consistent truth, create filters for false information, you're solving problems she first encountered. When you struggle with work-life balance, with maintaining personal identity while being constantly connected, you're facing her challenge of seasonal rhythms. The notification that just pinged on your phone, that's the smoke signal, evolved. The social media platform you scroll before sleep, that's the evening fire circle, digitized. The influencer you follow, the forum you trust, the group chat that keeps you sane, all nodes and network that began with one scarred woman choosing connection over isolation. But here's what Kira understood that we sometimes forget. Networks amplify everything. Truth and lies, connection and division, healing and harm. The same tools that unite us can divide us, depending on how we weave them. When you feel overwhelmed by information cascade, remember Tam learning to add source attribution. When false news spreads faster than truth, recall Brack's corruption and the network's learned resilience. When online connection feels hollow, think of Kira insisting that networks exist in the spaces between people, not in the structures themselves. When you worry about losing yourself in constant connectivity, remember the seasonal rhythms. Times to engage fully, times to withdraw and reconnect with your own identity. The network serves survival, but survival includes knowing who you are. The anthropological record shows a human succeeded not through individual strength, but collective intelligence. Not through hoarding information, but sharing it. Every innovation in our history came from someone seeing patterns at the edges and choosing to weave rather than withdraw. You carry that legacy. Every connection you make, every truth you share, every moment you choose understanding over isolation, you're adding threads to a web that began in firelight and continues in fiber optic cables. But remember too Brack's lesson, that skepticism served the network as much as faith. Question sources, challenge assumptions, test ideas before they spread. The network needs challengers as much as bridges. And when you feel small, just one node among billions, remember that Kira was just one person, scarred, isolated, seeing patterns from the edges. She didn't set out to change the world, just to find belonging. But in seeking connection for herself, she discovered principles that would reshape human society. The network doesn't need heroes. It needs humans. People willing to share their small truths, make their modest connections, solve their local problems. The pattern emerges from countless individual choices to connect rather than isolate. So the next time you reach for your phone, seeking that dopamine hit of notification, remember, you're not addicted to technology. You're addicted to connection, to the fundamental human need that Kira recognized and gave form to. Use it wisely. Share truth with context. Build bridges across difference. Include the skeptics. Protect identity while embracing connection. And always remember that the network lives not in any system or platform, but in the choice to see others clearly and help them see you. The edge is still off the clearest view. What patterns do you see? What connections will you weave? The network continues, waiting for your thread. Until next time, let the truth of deep time carry you into sleep.